local time, from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I don't know how long this video will last, but hopefully less than an hour. Anyway, this is an informal lesson about Operation Barbarossa, or Red Beard, named after Frederick Barbarossa, who was a medieval or Middle Ages Holy Roman Emperor. So it began officially on June the 22nd, 1941, even though its plans had started according to the French language Wikipedia already 1 year earlier. It was the attempt by the Nazi German dictator Adolf Hitler to force the Soviet Union through a quick military and economic collapse to agree to a peace treaty, which would have forced that huge country to surrender to Germany, especially a huge portion of its western territory. And that would have then given, according to the Nazi racial and racist ideology, enough living space for the supposedly superior Aryan Germanic peoples, at the expense of such subhumans as Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others, Jews, and then Romas or Gypsies. And at the start, it looked like Germany and its allies, counting from north to south, Finland, which, however, never had an official military alliance with Germany, but was rather a co-belligerent, a so-called brother in arms, then Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. So in all, at the start of the invasion in June 1941, Germany and its allies had mobilized over 3.6 million soldiers. At first, the Soviet Union had mobilized over 2.6 million soldiers. However, the Soviet Union, according to one source, which I have heard from contemporary source, had up to 20 million people or 20 million soldiers in its reserves. And after all, the Soviet Union in 1941 had a population of over 180 million people. Germany, even in its expanded form, I don't think it had more than about 110 million people, and I could even be a bit too optimistic. However, at the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi German army was clearly better trained, equipped, and supplied. The railway lines and highways were much better on the German side of the border than on the Soviet side of the border. For example, a much larger proportion of the German highways and roads than of the Soviet ones were paved. However, the fact that such a great majority of the Soviet roads and highways, especially outside the cities, were still dirt roads, actually became an advantage to the Red Army during the heavy rains of October 1941, when especially the central divisions of Germany and its allies in that sector, the Finns stayed in the north, by the way, because most of them wanted simply to conquer the areas that Finland had been forced to give up by the Treaty of Moscow in March 1940 at the end of the Winter War. Although certain nationalist Finns wanted Finland to conquer also part of the Soviet Karelia, Eastern Karelia. And the more optimistic ones, more nationalist ones, would have wanted Finland actually to conquer the Leningrad area and even expand all the way to the western ridges of the Ural Mountains, even though this was totally unrealistic. But anyway, in the first 3 months or so of the conflict, or 3.5 months before the heavy October rain started, the Germans and their allies, generally speaking, advanced rather quickly. However, most Soviet soldiers fought back bravely, and many of them, after surrendering their weapons actually escaped from the Germans because there were so many prisoners, Soviet prisoners, especially in the first months of the Operation Barbarossa, that the Germans simply did not have enough guards to watch over them. And many thousands of these escaped Soviet soldiers joined the partisans or Soviet communist guerrillas, even though many of them were caught and brutally tortured and then either executed by firing squad or by hanging. Still, many thousands kept joining them, and they conducted especially nightly raids on the Germans and their allies. During the October rains of 1941, especially the central divisions, as I said, bogged down and were slowed down considerably in their advance towards Moscow. When the winter came in early November 1941, the mud disappeared, obviously, but then the early and brutal onset of the winter 1941 to 1942 considerably increased the number of soldiers who were frostbitten. In his foolish optimism, Hitler had refused to issue winter clothing to more than just some percent of his troops. Of course, the Finns in the north were used to working in the cold, for example, doing forestry work in the cold, and of course, they had that recent experience of the brutally chilly weather during much of the Winter War, 1939 to 1940. So they were prepared, but relatively few of the Germans and their other allies were. And also, the brutal cold made many engines of the armored vehicles inoperable. And then, especially during the long, dark winter nights, there were those partisan attacks where thousands of Germans and their allies were killed. Nevertheless, the Germans soldiered on. Leningrad was surrounded in the autumn of 1941. Leningrad was the official name of St. Petersburg between 1924, after the death of the first Soviet dictator Lenin, and 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And then the Germans got to within, the sources vary, 8 kilometers according to the Grimberg History of the Nations, volume 21, or 30 kilometers according to the French Wikipedia of Moscow. Anyway, they reached the westernmost suburbs of Moscow, and German guns could actually be heard in the center of Moscow. But then a determined Soviet counterattack in early December 1941 pushed the Germans between 100 and 200 kilometers back. And they would never again, not even in the spring and summer of 1942, get as close to Moscow as they had been before the start of that determined counterattack. The Germans were able, by maximizing all of their forces, all of their available forces, basically of the Eastern Front, stop that retreat to between 100 and 200 kilometers, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. And even though young men would enter the Eastern Front in 1942, 1943, and even in 1944, already the losses of the first 10 months of conflict, from June 1941 to April 1942, approximately, they could never be fully replaced. And this was the beginning of the end of the German and the other Axis allies or powers' invasion of the Soviet Union. And to put a long story short, in August 1942, the German Sixth Army, led by Marshal General Friedrich Paulus, started to invade Stalingrad on the Volga River. The Volga River was the Soviet Union's longest river and is the current Russia's longest river. And as we know, by the start of February 1943, that battle ended in a disastrous failure under 100,000 men of the German Sixth Army and a smaller number of the Romanian troops who had been assisting the Germans were alive. The survivors were transported to war captivity, and most of them perished during that time. And we have to remember that because many, if not most, German soldiers and many Allied soldiers treated even the surrendered Soviet civilians and soldiers rather brutally, they became hated. If the Germans had been more lenient towards those Soviet civilians and soldiers who had genuinely surrendered to them and had welcomed them as liberators, they would have had more support by the civilian population, and perhaps they could have persisted in occupying some westernmost parts of the Soviet Union until 1945, but this is pure speculation. In the great tank or armored vehicle battle of Kursk in the Ukraine in July 1943, the Germans were defeated, and by January 1944, the Russians already had penetrated the pre-World War II eastern border of Poland, which then was situated about 200 kilometers to the east from what it is today, or has been since 1945. And by the fall of 1944, even the last German troops had retreated from the pre-World War II Soviet territory. So the casualties on both sides were enormous, but the Red Army had more potential reserves, and the Soviet Union had a greater industrial and human resources capacity than did Germany, and especially after the United States joined the war officially on the side of the Allied after the attack by divisions of the Japanese Air Forces on the US Pacific Naval Base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941. It was only a matter of time that the three Axis powers and their allies, the three main ones, of course, were the Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and authoritarian Japan. It was only a matter of time before they would be defeated. Italy was invaded from Sicily already in July 1943, leading to the quick toppling of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, although in a daring raid, some German soldiers were able to rescue him in September 1943, and he then spent the rest of his ignoble physical life in northern Italy as the nominal leader of the Italian Social Republic. But he was honest enough and humiliated enough to admit to visitors that he was truly only a nominal leader. And he was then caught and arrested with his mistress and various other Italian fascists near the end of April 1945, and after a summary trial, they were executed. Incidentally, Adolf Hitler committed suicide with his mistress turned wife, last-minute wife, Eva Braun, just 2 days after the execution of Mussolini and his mistress and those other Italian fascists who had been caught by anti-fascist forces. But anyway, Germany tied up much of its military arsenal in terms of soldiers, weapons, and military vehicles on the Eastern Front, the Soviet front, so that by the time the Western Allied invasion of Normandy and therefore France began in June 1944, Germany could no longer transfer many men from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, contrary to what had happened in March 1918 during the First World War, when by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Soviet Russia had surrendered various territories to Germany, and Germany had been able to transport 1 million men to the Western Front, but Germany ended up losing that war too. However, contrary to the Second World War, where Germany capitulated or surrendered unconditionally, Germany did not do so at the end of the fighting of the First World War, but signed an armistice. Originally, the invasion of the Soviet Union should have begun about 5.5 weeks earlier, on May the 15th, 1941, but especially because the remaining Greek troops, supported by, for example, British troops on the island of Crete, were so tenacious in resisting the Germans, the invasion was then postponed until June the 22nd, 1941. Theoretically, had the Greeks surrendered earlier and had the invasion begun in mid-May 1941, theoretically, Moscow could have been surrounded before the onset of winter, but whether it would have been conquered or not is another matter. Of course, Muscovites could, or the inhabitants of Moscow could have done what they did in October or September 1812, where they lit up many wooden houses, and since Moscow was still back in 1812 composed mostly of wooden houses, this meant that the many French and Allied troops of La Grande Armée, of the Great Army, faced very bad housing. And because the Russian winter began already in October 1812, they had to risk either starvation and bitter cold in Moscow, which was largely uninhabitable and contained few provisions of food or drink, or then they had to retreat back towards France. They chose the latter course, and during that retreat, many, or actually most of them, died or were imprisoned. Hitler hadn't learned enough about the lessons of Charles XII of Sweden, who tried to invade Russia in 1708, but was quickly forced by the scorched earth tactics to move southward, trek southward to the Ukraine to be able to feed his army. And since the winter of 1708 to 1709 was in much or most of Europe exceptionally cold, the Swedish and Allied armies or troops were reduced by thousands of men during that winter. And then Charles XII suffered the humiliating defeat of Poltava in the Ukraine, and most of his surviving soldiers were then transported to Siberia to captivity. He himself, with about 1,500 men or so, was able to escape with the rebellious Ukrainian Cossack chief Ivan Mazepa to the Ottoman Empire. Or in 1812, Napoleon himself was able to escape, but a great majority of his Grande Armée died, and then most of the survivors, or many of them, were imprisoned. And then likewise, the losses on the Eastern Front were disastrous and sealed the defeat of the Axis in Europe. Despite the fact that the Soviets had to station tens of divisions in the Far East because Stalin feared an invasion of the Soviet Far Eastern territories by Japan, that invasion actually never happened. But theoretically, the Japanese who occupied Manchuria in northeastern China could have invaded, for example, Vladivostok, a Soviet and now Russian city on the western coast of the Pacific Ocean. So to sum it up, Operation Barbarossa began rather well for Germany and its allies, but by the winter of 1941 to 1942, it turned into a disaster. And even though the last German troops only left the Soviet territory in the autumn of 1944, this was one of the main factors in Germany's disastrous, crushing, and unconditional defeat to the Allies in the Second World War. And the defeat was then sealed. The unconditional surrender was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and some other German representatives in May 1945. The war in Asia would continue for another 3 months as far as the fighting was concerned. The eventual Soviet invasion of northern China and Mongolia, and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at last forced the Japanese to surrender. I wish you a very healthy and blessed, peaceful and inspiring last week of July, and a wonderful and blessed August ahead. Bye bye.